Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Israel Matters. I'm, of course, Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and with me, as always, is Elliot Chodoff, strategic military analyst, history expert, and from your Facebook posts, a lot of culinary stuff going on in the Chodoff home as well.
Hey, you gotta eat. You might as well eat well.
Okay, so we're after the holidays, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, are completed. They're behind us. The high holiday season is behind us. The traditional Jewish greeting for this day of the year is have a good winter, because we have, now the winter months are ahead of us. We start praying for rain, and hopefully we'll have a very rainy winter as we did last winter. Just like to share a quick thought on the weekly Torah portion. The first Shabbat after the Feast of Tabernacles is the Shabbat that we start the new cycle of the reading of the Torah. So the Torah portion is actually the creation story and the few chapters after that, leading up till the days of Noah. And just wanted to share a very quick thought. In the opening chapters of Genesis, of course, we have the first family, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, that first family. And there are two sins that take place right at the beginning. We could call them the first two sins, the two original sins that take place. There is, of course, the sin of eating from the tree, followed by the sin of Cain killing his brother Abel. Those are the first two transgressions in the Bible. And in both of them, just wanted to point this out, in both of them, God asks the sinner a question in response to the sin. He asks Adam, "Where are you?" And he asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" Now, obviously, God knows the answers to both of these questions. And that's what makes them so profound. And I think that if we really...
May I interject? He actually also asks a third question, which is the second one to Cain, and that is, what have you done?
That's right. What have you done? Leading up to describing what he did. But, the idea of God asking a question to the sinner, I think, is very interesting, especially when we're talking about the first two sins in the Bible. And I think that if we just, as readers of the Bible, as believers in the Bible, if we just listen to what the words are telling us, I think these are the two questions that God asks us all the time. The first sin was not a sin against anyone else. Eating of the tree was a violation of God's dictate. It was a violation of that relationship. So God said to Adam, "Where are you?" Meaning, where are you in this relationship with me? And the second sin, of course, was the quintessential sin against another human being. It was murder. And to that, God said, "Where's your brother?" And I think those are questions that we have to answer every day. Where are we in our relationship to God? And where are we in our relationship to our fellow human beings? So that's just a simple thought about those opening two sins in the Bible and what we could take from it. Just wanted to share that. Now, Elliot, there's never a dull moment in the Middle East.
Yes.
And as we've talked about, sometimes the events that shape things are really just like things that get leaked to the media. Like, we've talked about this before, that when something is talked about in the media, besides what's being talked about, we also always have to ask ourselves, why did they say that? And this week, we had this little news story
why now?
Yeah, why now? So there was this news story that Bashar Assad, the head of the dictator of Syria, was quoted in Russian government media, and that's obviously very loaded. They don't have free media in Russia. Russian government press interviewed Assad, and in the interview, they asked him if he would ever normalize relations with Israel. To which Assad replied that he would consider it if he got the Golan Heights back. Now, that whole thing led me, I read that and I was like, okay, let's forget about the fact that Israel's never giving him the Golan Heights. Fine. But if Russian
Right.
government media is asking that question and Assad is giving that answer, and then I thought about the fact that Assad, who is one of the chief enemies of Israel, interestingly, did not criticize the UAE and Bahrain deals with Israel. He said nothing about them. And I was wondering, okay, why now? Why in this way? What is this about? And what exactly is Russia's role in all of this? We've talked a lot about Hezbollah and Iran and a little bit about Syria, and we know the Russians are heavily involved here. We've never really explored that. So I'm throwing this all out to you, Elliot, and maybe this is more than one episode, but as always, can you make sense of this for us?
I'll try. First of all, I think that let me start with the Syrian part of it, because that'll sort of take us into the Russian. The Syrians are in no position to make deals with anybody right now. In other words, the capital that he brings to the table is so low that there's no point, which is also his support or non-support of the UAE deal is totally irrelevant. Silence was the best thing he could do. So that's number one. Number two, it's old news, very old news, that the Syrians say, first give us the Golan, and then we'll have a discussion about what goes on afterwards. And they know it's a non-starter, and we know it's a non-starter. Going back even to the father, to Hafez, back in the 90s, I said at the time during the negotiations, they're not going to come to terms. They have absolutely no reason whatsoever to make peace with us. And
So
they
this
have
all
every
leads to the
reason
question
not
of the
to make
timing
peace.
of this little interview.
The timing and the context. And that brings us to Russia. So let's start with the fact that the American brokered Emirates, Bahrain, and whoever else is waiting in line agreements basically leaves the Russians out. And the Russians don't like to be left out. The Russians have a very, very strong interest in this region. And they're a little annoyed now because America has been pulling out of the region. And even under Trump, he's been making all sorts of noises of getting out. But no matter what, they keep staying in. You know, just when Putin thinks he's rid of them, there they are again with, pulling some other rabbit out of the hat. And this is driving the Russians crazy, because the Russians, for the decades since the end of World War II, since the beginning of the Cold War, have had a very, very strong interest, strategic interest in the Middle East. And they've done all sorts of strange things in order to maintain it, including voting in favor of partition. That the Soviet bloc votes in 1947 were critical in the General Assembly Resolution 181 partition plan actually passing.
In other words,
And
founding
in
of the
part
state
that
of
was because
Israel,
they hoped
the founding of the state of Israel wouldn't have happened without the Soviet bloc.
Correct. And let's remember that back in the day, due to all sorts of quirkiness of the way the UN was set up, the Russians actually had a number of votes, because Ukraine, which was totally under Russian control, had its own vote. They had something like 3 or 4. Don't quote me on the exact number, but they had, as if America would say, you know what, we're really 50 states, we should have 50 votes. Russia played that game and won in that sense. So their votes were critical. And in part, there are two ways of looking at it, and the Russians could look at it both ways simultaneously. And one is either Israel shows its gratitude by going in with the Russians, which it did not do, or alternatively, there'll be a conflict and they can always jump in on the other side if necessary, and that is what happened. And we're very much behind escalating the conflict in 1967. They helped escalate in 1973. In other words, a lot of what goes on has the Russians behind it there. Now, what I want to do for us to really help understand this is go back before the Cold War.
Or the Cold War.
Because, well, before. To do two things, sort of one in after the other in sequence. Problem number one, or issue number one, is that the Middle East is the most important strategic region in the world, and it's been that way for, give or take, 3,000-4,000 years. Now, to say 3,000 or 4,000 years isn't just, I mean, that's an impressive number, but it's a number that transcends two very important factors, which here basically are not relevant because in over 3,000 or 4,000 years, these two factors get negated. The first is technology. In other words, we're living in a world today where we say, oh, with new technology, we don't need all those old rules. Well, guess what? Every generation of humanity since Adam has said that. Every generation says we're in a new world of technology. And then the next generation says, oh, now we're in a new world of technology. So, okay, that's nice. But here, ever since, this region has been important. And that transcends technology. I'll get back to the reasons for why in a moment. The other thing that transcends is the world political order. In other words, the way things were when the Assyrians were interested in this region are different from today, and different from when the Ottomans came in and when the Byzantines came in, and pick your empire, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks. Each period had its own sort of
in the ancient
global
world,
structure.
it had a lot to do, in the ancient world, it had a lot to
structure.
do with controlling trade routes, and that's not the issue anymore.
It still does. It certainly is the issue. That's the whole point. Remember that trade routes, maritime routes, and naval extension are the exact same thing. Just like roads and military movement, roads for commerce and military movement are exactly the same thing. I'm old enough to almost remember when the United States interstate system was built. It's called today the Eisenhower system in the 1950s. The interstate system was built by the Defense Department for the rapid movement of force around the country. Okay, now anybody who's driven in the United States, any distances traveled interstates, those roads are critical to commerce, but they were built for military purpose. And they're still there, I mean, they're still maintained for that. Because if you need to move force, whether it's by land or by sea, those routes very quickly shift from commercial to military. And if you don't have them, you've got a problem. Now, the Middle East is a critical geographical area for two reasons. One is the obvious one, and anybody who's played Risk knows this. It's the land bridge between the continents. It's that sort of keystone center between Asia, Africa, and Europe. But to come back to what we were just talking about, it's also the bridge between oceans. Now, the Suez Canal makes it very clear today, in the past century plus. Although you should know, you may not know this, in ancient times, there was a Suez Canal. It wasn't the same route that's taken today because it didn't need to be, they didn't need a canal of the magnitude for modern shipping that we have today in the 21st century, and had in the 20th century. But in ancient times, a canal was cut from the Nile to the Gulf of Suez, and ships were able to get from the Mediterranean out into the Red Sea via the Nile.
Wow.
In addition to that, in ancient times, they also knew that there was trade between Europe and the Far East in ancient times. It's not just a modern phenomenon, post Marco Polo. It was known that the quickest way to get stuff from Europe to the Far East, if the canal wasn't working for whatever reason, because it wasn't always in operation, it wasn't always maintained, would be to ship stuff to the southern port of Israel Ashkelon at the time. Today it's Ashdod, but in those days it was Ashkelon. And then schlep it overland to what is today's Eilat and ship it out of Eilat, Etzion Gaver, and from there out the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. That was a lot easier than going around Africa. So here you've got, and look at Israel as a microcosm of it. You've got this ridiculously small country that is a port that faces out to the Indian Ocean and from there to the Pacific, and two ports that go from the Mediterranean out to the Atlantic. How many countries have that? Now, if you look at it in Egypt, is the other one, right? But if you look at it in regional terms, anybody who controls this region has access to the Atlantic and the Pacific, which is why in ancient times they tried to do it. In other words, if they came from the West, from Europe or Africa, they tried to get a foothold either on the Red Sea or on the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And if they came from the East, they tried to get a foothold on the Mediterranean. And hint, the Turks are trying to get a foothold on the Gulf, and the Iranians are trying to get a foothold on the Mediterranean. Those are the two local empires.
So where does the Russian interest in the area begin? Because we don't see it in the Middle Ages.
So now let's overlay the Russian problem. I've given you the solution. Now let's look at the Russian problem. Russia, not the Soviets, not Putin. Russia, historical imperial Russia, has a problem. And that is that its natural naval bases are north of the Arctic Circle. And they freeze during the winter. And people who are familiar with strategic literature know that what the Russians are said to need are warm water ports. Now, what warm water port means is ports that don't freeze in the winter. Because if in order to play the Atlantic game, and the European game is the Atlantic game, which is one of the reasons why NATO is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As the Germans learned the hard way in 2 world wars, if you can't control the Atlantic, you can't control Europe. If Russia wants to compete with America in the Atlantic, it needs naval bases through which it can get out 12 months a year whenever they need it. Now, during the Soviet era, the Soviets had a major fleet base and shipyard in Sevastopol in the Crimea. Why do you think Putin went there a number of years ago? I don't know if you remember that when he went into the Crimea, then Secretary of State Kerry very indignantly said, somebody has to explain to Mr. Putin that we're in the 21st century and 19th century strategies don't apply anymore. So somebody has to explain to Mr. Kerry that strategy is strategy and it doesn't matter whether it's the 19th, the 20th, or the 21st. The fleet base that the Russians were using was Ukrainian at this point, and they were leasing it from the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians told Putin, you know what, we may not renew the lease. And Putin said, no problem. Now he doesn't have to lease it from him anymore. He took it. He owns it. But Sevastopol, listen, you don't want to lease it to me?
It's kind of like Don
We can
Corleone.
do it my way, we can do it your way. You know, it's not a problem. Exactly. Either your brains or your signature are going to be on this contract.
Right, exactly.
Now, with all of its advantages, and Sevastopol does is a warm water port, it has a problem. And that problem is that it's on the Black Sea, and the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean via Turkey, via the Bosporus. Now, in times of peace like now, it's not an issue because the Bosporus, by agreement, is an international body of water. But what happens in wartime? Let's keep in mind that the Turks and the Russians have been enemies for about 400 years. And that hasn't gone away, and it's getting worse now that Erdogan is making his imperial moves, see note to his east, Greece, every which way. And he can choke them, he can lock them in. What do? You skip over it. Now, during the Cold War period, the Russians had major fleet bases in Egypt and Syria, in Alexandria, in Latakia, and they did it for a reason. And by the way, during those years, and I actually, for sins committed in a previous life, I spent a year in the Israeli Navy in the mid-1980s. There was always a Russian ship off Haifa, always, just outside our territorial limits, monitoring everything our Navy did from up close where it could see it. Because we were a threat to the Russians, because we were part of the American constellation. So the Russians' interest primarily is ports. They have two in Syria today, one in Latakia, another one in Tartus, and they're developing them. That's their core interest. There's a secondary interest, and that is that anything America does, the Russians want to counter. So, and why? Because America is the adversary. And Putin is a chess player, and he knows you don't give your adversary an advantage, even if there's no clear consequence that you can see of that advantage. Somewhere down the road,
you just don't want him getting stronger. Yeah.
Yeah, strength can be measured in many different ways. You don't want them getting stronger. You don't want them in a position where they can outmaneuver you. You don't want them to gain allies where you can have the other countries be neutral or adversaries. It's a just because. In other words, it doesn't have to be, I see this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. And Putin is an expert at that. Absolute expert at it. So America abdicated its control, its power in this region over the past 2 decades. It started under Bush Jr. It started by withdrawing forces from this area. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, 3 years ago, an American aircraft carrier docked at Haifa for the first time in 17 years. Do you remember when that happened?
Yeah.
Now, why? Okay, Haifa used to be a regular port of call for the Sixth Fleet. Why was this aircraft carrier the first in 17 years to dock in Haifa? So the answer is the Trump administration, but not for the reasons you may think. Because under George W. Bush, 17 years, 20 years ago now, roughly, America withdrew its aircraft carrier from the Mediterranean. There had always been a carrier task force in the Mediterranean with the Sixth Fleet. They withdrew it. In other words, America was aircraft carrierless in the Mediterranean for 17 years. And that provided all sorts of other players a field to play on, including the so-called Arab Spring makers, which we now call the Islamic Winter, terrorist organizations, and ultimately countries like Russia, Turkey. The Russians have now reestablished their position, and they're not going to give it up easily. So much of what we're seeing in terms of their playing, and including their meddling in America, and by the way, Russians meddling in American elections shouldn't surprise anybody. The Russians have been meddling in everybody's elections as long as there's been a Russia. It's what they do. And by the way, America meddles in other countries' elections. Let's not be overly righteous about this. But because Russia is playing the global game, and just to recap and conclude, the Middle East is a critical component in the Russians' game. The Russians know it, the Turks know it, the Iranians know it, the Chinese know it, everybody in the region knows it. The only people who missed this class is Washington. The Americans, and I don't mean currently, I'm talking about for decades, the Americans have not fully appreciated the critical strategic importance of the Middle East to their global power position. And they've always treated it in a sort of goofy kind of side game.
Or almost
Kissinger
ideological.
might be the.
They've almost treated it ideologically, like Israel's our ally, but
yes.
So if we
right,
obviously we're not at a full answer yet.
No,
but if we could just, can we make an assumption about this weird little news story that I started with, that somehow, based on what you're saying, this is what I'm understanding, that this is Putin's way of making himself relevant in terms of potential peace deals? Is that what he's doing?
Exactly. That's exactly what he's doing. He is showing that he's still in the game, and that America is not the only player who can deliver peace in the Middle East, even if it's pure mis or disinformation. Because that whole Syrian front is a non-starter from an Israeli perspective, with a weak Assad barely controlling parts of his country, starting with a demand that we didn't give him 20 years ago, because we also know what he means by the entire Golan Heights. It means he wants the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, so that's why I was wondering if maybe there's something darker at work here, and that is that really this interview, this little story with Assad, was Putin's way of telling Netanyahu, if you want a good relationship with me, you're going to have to play my game with Syria.
No, I don't think so. I think, look, as I said before, Putin's a chess player. He's not going to play a move that he knows he can't win. And Russia doesn't have anywhere near the leverage. America doesn't have the leverage to make that work. Russia doesn't have anywhere near that. No, I think it's much more. It's a gambit. It has no real content value, but it has a great deal of sort of packaging value. That not everything going on having to do with the perhaps possibility of maybe some sort of an agreement coming out. Not all of it is being done in Washington. Here, we in Moscow are doing it too, and that's really, it's all in that sense, it's all veneer.
Right. So, Elliot, maybe we could already set the stage for next week's discussion, and we can maybe we could keep talking about Russia, and maybe start to understand more in the real world situation that has developed, the chaos that has developed over the last decade in Syria and Lebanon. What exactly the Russia-Israel relationship is in light of all of that? Because in terms of our own security as Israelis, in terms of potential threats on the horizon, Russia is a hard nut to crack. And maybe we could just whet our appetites for next week. But like the whole relationship between Netanyahu and Putin is interesting, and maybe that's something we can talk about next week.
Yes. All I'll say about it here is that we are not in the Cold War anymore, and the game that's being played is the nature of the game is different. The rules of the game are somewhat different. The background rules to the game remain the same as they've always been for thousands of years.
All right. So let me just close by asking everyone watching this. Oh, sorry. Were you finished?
No. Just to finish the point, the grand objectives remain the same. The specific objectives are situational based on what's going on in the world at any given point. And I'll leave this as a teaser. Putin, the dictator of Russia today, is not Putin, the colonel of the KGB, in terms of his outlook. In his methods, yes, but his outlook, no.
Okay, we're going to have to explore that next time. That's a bit of a riddle to me. So I just want to reiterate to everyone watching this, thank you very much for spreading the word. Please reach out to us with your questions, with your comments. And if you would like either Elliot or myself to do a Zoom with you, a group where you are, please reach out to us. We would be more than happy to do it. There's so much to talk about. And as I started with, everyone have a good, safe winter. God bless.